and welcome to this budget banter, as titled by our friends at the Curtin Research Centre. My name's Emma Dawson. I'm Executive Director at Capita, and I'm coming to you today from the lands of the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. And I'm joined by my friends at progressive think tanks across the country, Nick Dyrenfurth from the Curtin Research Centre, David Epstein from the Chifley Research Centre, and Michael Buckland from the McKell Institute. And our very special guest today, Daniel Mulino MP, who is the chair of the House Economics Committee in the Albanese Labor Government and is here to share his thoughts on the recently announced first budget, the first Chalmers budget of the Albanese Labor Government. We'll then go through some of our own reflections on what came out of the budget this week and last night's slightly strange budget reply. And there will be an opportunity for all of you to ask some questions and make some comments towards the end of our time together today. Please post any questions you may have into the Q&A function, which you can see at the bottom of your screen. We'll do our best to get to as many of them as possible. Please be aware that we are recording this webinar and it will be available from all of these think tanks here present today once we've finished editing the top and tail of this recording where we're chatting amongst ourselves. So thank you very much again for being with us. I've got back from Canberra last night, so if I'm a little bit off my game, you'll forgive me, but I'm sure someone that's had an equally big week, if not more so, is Daniel Mulino. And thanks so much for joining us, Daniel.
Well, thanks very much, Emma. Can I just begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're all meeting around the country and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Can I also acknowledge you, Emma, and also David, Nick and Michael, and just say that the organisations that are jointly hosting today, and I identify them in alphabetical order, Chifley, Curtin, McKell and Per Capita, have really played a critical role for a long time in the public policy and intellectual life of Australia. But can I just say, as somebody who's spent the last 3 years in opposition, all four of these organisations have played a really critical role in providing creative, innovative, rigorous policy ideas to Labor in opposition, and are now in government. They're going to play a critical role as well. So I did want to thank all four organisations for the chance to come here, but also just to stress how important they are in Australia's policy and intellectual scene. So look, I think it was, for me, look, it's been a great week. Obviously, being in government is so much better, and it's always exciting being involved in the first budget of a new government and seeing the budget presented in a chamber where the opposition are squirming. I think Stephen Jones described the opposition as bin chickens scratching around for relevance. And as Emma alluded to, you know, we saw that a bit in the response last night. I think it's been a bit incoherent and formless. In terms of the key strategies of the government, the first is that clearly in an environment where inflation is high and probably still rising a bit further, where interest rates are high, where people are struggling, we've prioritised targeted and responsible cost of living measures, but cost of living measures that will make a difference to people, and in particular, the most vulnerable. It's also a budget which includes a lot of serious policy investments to boost the long-term productivity and resilience of our economy, and builds on a lot of things the government had been working on in the preceding years. And it also undertakes some serious budget repair, which is going to give us buffers which we will need. So on the first point, there are some serious cost of living measures. You all know a lot of the key ones, but it includes cheaper childcare, expanding paid parental leave, cheaper medicines, more affordable housing, and getting wages working. So all of those are really important. They're important in many cases as important reforms in and of themselves, expanding opportunity and microeconomic reforms, but they're critically important at this time of cost of living pressures. I mean, wages in particular, something the opposition, then government pushed back on was a wage increase for those on the minimum wage, that 5.2% wage increase, which is now so critical. That's something which is backed in. We've got aged care pay increases, which are going to be coming through the pipeline, and bargaining changes going into Parliament this week. So there's a whole lot of really important policy there. I just wanted to very briefly say that aligning fiscal and monetary policy in the way that the Treasurer has undertaken this week is not something that we should take for granted. And indeed, it's something which I think you can argue that the opposition is undermining in their response. And I was going through a bit of history, and I won't go into excruciating detail here, but Alan Blinder from Princeton looked at the last 10 monetary tightenings in the US over the last period of 80 years or so. And the most analogous to the situation we find now is the early 70s with the oil crisis. And if you look at the period of the early 70s in the US, inflation had already started to rise in the US before the oil crisis due to a crop failure. And what happened in the early 70s was that interest rates were raised by 960 basis points over the course of 72 to 74. But in the middle of that was a massive fiscal expansion in 72 to get Nixon re-elected. And so what we saw in the 70s, not just in the US, in a range of countries, was fiscal policy and monetary policy at odds with them. And that is terrible, a terrible way to manage the economy. And we can see what happened in the US in the 70s and following as a result of that. And indeed, one can look more recently at what happened in the UK with the very brief Truss experiment. So look, aligning fiscal and monetary policy is absolutely critical if we're going to get inflation under control in a way that protects the most vulnerable in society, the people that we're looking after. And I think you can look at what happened in the 70s as a case study in how, if it's not done right, you can have lingering problems that hurt people's standard of living for a long period of time. So I think the responsible way that this budget was crafted is absolutely appropriate, and it's important that the government continues on in that vein. I did just want to also highlight, in finishing off these brief introductory remarks, in saying that there's also a lot of medium-term reform in this budget, some which we'd already started to work on. There's the National Reconstruction Fund, there's investment in skills and TAFE, which was boosted coming out of the Jobs and Skills Summit, which a number of the people on this call participated in. There's the migration boost. There's a really strong infrastructure pipeline, $120 billion, but of course much more rigorous. We've taken out a whole bunch of projects which didn't stack up and wouldn't have delivered. And then, of course, there's the whole clean energy agenda, which I'm sure we'll be discussing during the course of today's discussion. And finally, just to say on the fiscal front, there were $22 billion in saves, which partly reflected some of those infrastructure projects which didn't stack up and which were really part of a deal with the Nats to sign up to net zero. But what the government's done is a really responsible way to deal with the cyclical windfall of around $40 billion in this budget, and a bit more than that over the coming 4 years. 99% of that fiscal windfall was returned to the budget in the first 2 years, and 92% over the forward estimates. That's a stark contrast to what had happened under both the Howard governments and the previous Abbott, Turnbull, Morrison governments. So I think it's a really impressive budget. It's a difficult budget for difficult times. We haven't faced a scenario like this for half a century. And when we go back to when it happened last, we can see what happens if you don't deal with this situation like this in a measured and responsible way.
Thanks so much, Daniel. I'm going to ask David Epstein to give the first response and some of his own reflections.
Thanks for that, Emma. Look, I mean, I'll start with where Daniel finished. I mean, I think he made some very good points. First of all, quoting Alan Blinder, and there will be people who remember Alan's great work, hard heads and soft hearts, and that's something that perhaps underpins a bit of the strategy behind this government. But it's also going back to that situation of, the late 60s, early 70s, the Nixon era, where there was a bit of a disjunct between monetary and fiscal policy. And perversely, we've been in that situation, perhaps for the last 18 months or 2 years, because we've come off the back of a couple of decades where it's been, the zeitgeist has been to very much distinguish the management of both monetary and fiscal policy. And at times people have forgotten that you do need to have some common purpose. And that's perhaps the importance of this budget, in that it's about resetting parameters and defining the boundaries of strategy and then applying strategy on a medium and long-term basis. Whereas, particularly under the Morrison government, the notion of medium and long-term strategy was just basically thrown out the window. So we've had a lot of commentary post the budget that, perhaps some opportunities for major long-term structural change, particularly on the fiscal side, have been met. And I think they sort of miss the point very much, in that they forget that this is really a special budget. It's the second budget for the year, and it's potentially the first of four for this government. It's what we used to call a mini budget. So therefore, you shouldn't expect, and indeed, it's perhaps risky to expect a government to apply all of the changes that it might need to do, particularly in fiscal policy, first up, because you've actually got to spend a bit of time on these things. I mean, I worked in the Hawke-Keating years, and when we did what they used to call the quality changes on the fiscal side, sometimes the policy development process would take 18 months or 2 years. So it's completely unrealistic to expect the government to have done these things in time for this mini budget. But what they have done is confirmed very much the directions they set out in the election campaign. They've rearranged spending and policy priorities accordingly. They've sent the signals. As Daniel pointed out, they've reversed some $22 billion of flawed coalition spending, which probably didn't have a lot of strategy behind it other than being about re-electing a coalition government. They've been responsible in picking up the cyclical dividend that we've had. Over $36 billion has just come straight back down on the bottom line. So those people who are looking for things beyond this should really be thinking about the next 1 and 2 budgets, not this one. This budget has said, okay, we are going to have a strategy. This is the direction of the strategy, and here's some down payments. So in that sense, I mean, I think that the government's sort of done what it needed to do.
Thanks so much, David. And all preempting quite a few comments and questions we're getting in the chat, so we'll come to those later. Michael, you're up next. What are your thoughts on the first Albanese Labor government or mini budget?
Fantastic, thank you, and thank you, Daniel, for joining us. I think that, and I'd be keen on your thoughts, that what I was struck by was the focus on the extent of delivering on the election commitments. So there was certainly it seemed normally I would have thought in line with the general direction of the budget, policy commitments would have been staggered over the years. It looks like actually the Treasurer and Prime Minister have put a lot of effort into getting a lot of them in right now. In fact, I think the only big commitment I saw that wasn't an election commitment was the paid parental leave program. And so I see, things like the childcare, the changes to the childcare subsidy, which we've all done work on, and that's fantastic. Free TAFE was a particular one we've got an interest in, and that was fantastic too. I wanted to, though, ask you, while we've got you, about two that in the public domain have been considered probably ones we haven't, the government haven't been able to achieve. And that is in the promise around cheaper electricity and real wage growth. So I think, I certainly think that while Rewiring the Nation and others are going to put great downward pressure on prices in the current environment, no one can expect electricity prices to be falling. But, these certainly are things that I think certain commentators are trying to grab onto as a way to criticize the budget. And I wanted to get your thoughts on that, Daniel.
So did you want me to do that?
Yeah, is that all right?
Yeah. Oh, great. Sure, yes. So, yeah, look, and I think it's an important one for you to raise, Michael, because it has been so much of a focus in the chamber and in question time that it was interesting to me that it probably took up half the questions at the press club event. So I think the opposition definitely feels like it's onto something. Now, one thing I would say is that the opposition, firstly, is mischaracterised a commitment that was made, which is that there would be a reduction in electricity prices by 2025, and they're framing it as, why aren't electricity prices down on day one of your government? So look, they're certainly, and that's what oppositions, I suppose, will sometimes do when they have the opportunity to. Look, a point that both Jim and Chris have made this week is that the modelling that was by Reputex was undertaken pre the Ukraine war. And so, of course, we are seeing some impacts in our electricity market with gas prices having increased substantially, and gas remains a firming source of electricity in our grid. So it is going to have an impact on prices in the spot market. So, look, we need to figure out a way to communicate that the underlying modelling would be flagged, which is that there will be downward pressure if we invest more in the transmission network, invest more in large-scale renewables, is valid still. I mean, that is basically the transition that all are going through. We have to figure out a way to cleanly and simply communicate that there's also an unexpected event that's occurred since that modelling was undertaken. Now, the other unexpected event, of course, which occurred since that modelling was undertaken is that Angus Taylor changed regulations to hide a 20% increase in electricity prices from their usual time of being published day after the election. So again, there's some electricity price increases that are already in the system this financial year, which Angus Taylor changed regulations to make sure weren't published during the last election. So it is a little bit of a more complicated scenario for us to explain that election commitment. The difficulty, of course, that electricity prices are going to be increasing over the next 2 years, largely as a result of the war in the Ukraine. And we just need to figure out a way to communicate. If we take a step back to what the opposition implicitly seems to be saying, both in question time and more broadly, when they attack us for investing more in Marinus Link, when they attack us for investing more in, are they going back to their previous position that we don't want to go down the path of more renewables in the system? Are they going back to their old position where they don't want to undertake the clean energy transition? So look, they are, in a sense, getting a couple of cheap hits, but I do think the Australian public will realise pretty quickly that implicitly what they're basically doing in attacking our plan, which was laid out before the election, which is investment in transition and providing certainty so that there's much more investment in renewables. Like, what is it they're suggesting as an alternative? And then that's, I think, what we need to start clearly communicating also. And on the wages growth, look, I think on the wages growth, look, we've got the 5.2% logged in, which I think is a really significant achievement. We have some other, we've got the aged care case, which will be handed down in the not too distant future. I've actually been talking to, a few economists over the last couple of days, partly in preparation for today, just to kind of touch on a few issues. And look, it's the wage price index, which is measured quarterly. I think they've now started to measure it monthly, and that's an overdue change. Look, it is a lagging indicator. And I think there's a feeling that it is probably going to rise materially over the next couple of readings. It's just not clear how quickly at this point. But certainly the case that, us supporting the increase in the minimum wage at the Fair Work Commission and the changes that workers brought into the parliament around the bargaining system will further improve workers' outcomes over the next 12 to 24 months on top of what's already in the system.
Well, certainly, I hope that with inflation running at 7%, the best way to deliver real wage growth is probably to lower inflation. I don't think anyone other than maybe the Qantas CEO is going to be getting 7% pay rises. So anyway, I'll leave it for my time and pass to Nick. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. Nick, over to you.
Thanks, Emma, and thanks to the Capita team for doing the hard grunt work, putting this event together, especially Meredith. And thanks to Daniel for coming on board this afternoon. It's a busy week. I'll keep my sort of commentary on the budget fairly brief. At the Curtin Research Centre, we were particularly pleased with the Housing Accord announcement, something that we have been arguing for a sustained period, particularly bringing together different levels of government, federal, state, local, because that's the only way you can tackle this devilish problem of housing affordability and supply and housing, located in close to people's jobs, schools, and other amenities. And we think there's still a lot of scope to extend that work in government, because we have this very strange situation up until now where institutional investors, in particular industry super funds, are investing in affordable housing such as build to rent, etc., in the United States and the UK, because the tax and regulatory settings which crisscross federal and state governments are precluding them from getting the sort of serious institutional investment doing which they'd like to do. But there are problems around, getting a serious return on investment. Minor point, I was also pleased to see the investment in hydrogen as a clean energy source, and one of the key sort of drivers in the transition to a carbon neutral economy, with the announcement of the investment in Townsville, but also the certification scheme, which included hydrogen, which allowed markets to verify and value clean energy sources such as hydrogen. To Daniel, I guess my overarching question, taking on board David's excellent point about this being, a mini budget, and the real deal will come next May, and so we can't, it's not realistic to expect a newish government to be embarking on a major structural budget repair, but we do know that there is a structural deficit, a disjunction between outlays and receipts, and this is built up really over the last 10 decades, in a point which Jim has made repeatedly over election cycles, that the coalition government were spending money, but it wasn't really a long-term investment in the country and its people. So the overarching question I wanted to ask you, Daniel, was, do you think over the sort of medium to long term, Australians are up for a mature and tough conversation about tax and spending settings? I'll give you a bit of a Dorothy Dixer here as well. Where do you see your recent book, which we helped launch, and I know you did an event with Capita as well, Safety Net, the Future of Welfare Australia, potentially addressing some of the dilemmas facing Australia on this score, and how this can be best achieved in turbulent times, but with an overarching goal of budget repair, addressing the structural deficit, but doing this in a Labor way, with fairness at its core.
I mean, I don't know if I'd necessarily, but thank you for the reference to the book. Well, I don't know if I'd call a question on the structural deficit as a Dorothy at this, but I think you're raising very important questions, and also, can I just, before answering that question, just acknowledge all the work that you've done, with others at times on housing. I think a lot of the ideas that you've been putting forward the last 3 years are reflected in this budget, and will probably be further explored as the Accord is fleshed out. And it's a first order issue. And as you say, I think for us to make progress on housing, it's going to take us working on all the different levers and working with the other two levels of government. So I think there's a really good framework that is put forward in this budget, but there's a lot of work to be done. And yeah, and making reference back to David's point, look, I think the analogy or the comparison to mini budgets in the Hawke-Keating era isn't a bad one. And as David alluded to, I think there was a lot of good policy work reflected in this budget, but we should also bear in mind it's a budget that came into publication 6 months after an election, and as David alluded to, budgets undertaken 18 to 24 months after governments come into power often reflect much more long-term policy development. You talk, Nick, about the structural deficit, and I think it's fair to say that in the out years, it's estimated in the forward years, but also beyond there at around 2% of GDP. Of course, these things are difficult to estimate precisely, but it's material. I would just say I think we need to look at these things in a bit of context. We are a country with gross and net debt as a percentage of GDP that is still manageable. We're still rated as AAA. The ratings agencies look at Australia without any kind of concern. So I do think we need to look at the areas of growth in spending which Katie and Jim have identified: NDIS, healthcare, aged care, defence, and the interest bill with a great deal of seriousness. But I think we also should start from a position where we don't want to also overblow the urgency in cutting back. But you're right. I mean, those medium and long-term structural issues are things we're going to have to face up to. And I guess if I go back to, where I looked at some of these issues in my book, I guess my position is I think there are some areas where we can, if we more clearly define long-term outcomes, and particularly with people who are more vulnerable, if we invest more upfront, we can often over the medium to longer term get better outcomes, and often with less investment if we are willing to go through that kind of process. So for me, the low-hanging fruit is for a given envelope of spending, are there ways in which in areas like NDIS and healthcare and aged care, we can get better outcomes for a given envelope of spending? But I totally acknowledge that that's not the total answer, and that there are a number of pressures. There's scope creep in a number of programs. There's an ageing society. There are a number of areas like aged care and the health system where costs are rising faster than CPI. So, look, I think over the medium term, we need to figure out how much we can get more bang for our buck, but we will probably end up also in a discussion around if we want to maintain services or improve services with all of those other pressures, we'll eventually get into a debate around what kinds of funding sources we're willing to look at. I mean, one thing I would say about that discussion, though, is that if you look at the stage 3 tax cuts discussion, for example, that's even if we were to revisit that in this discussion, that doesn't affect the budget for a couple of years. So I think in terms of the priority of the government right now, it's trying to figure out how we best align fiscal and monetary policy and help vulnerable people in what's going to be an inflationary and high interest rate period over the next 18 to 24 months, and one in which we just don't know the trajectory yet of inflation and interest rates. So we need to manage all of that while acknowledging that a bit further down the track from there, I do think the discussion that you've alluded to is going to then come to the fore.
Thanks, Daniel.
Thank you both. Really important issue, I think, and one that we can see the Treasurer and Prime Minister and Finance Minister laying the ground for some pretty serious conversations with the community over coming years. My turn, I think. I've been up in Canberra all week and have been speaking at various events linked to the Women's Budget Statement and the fact that this is the first time we've had a proper Women's Budget Statement in best part of a decade. And at the event to launch that statement yesterday at Parliament House, Minister Katie Gallagher was quite clear that she sees this as a first step, Daniel, in moving towards restoring genuine gender responsive budgeting, which of course Australia pioneered in the 1980s under the Hawke government with the championing by Senator Susan Ryan and Anne Summers, who was the head of the Office for Women. As chair of the Economics Committee, I'm really interested in your views about how gender responsive budgeting will roll out across the government and across the public sector, because of course this first women's budget statement is terrific and really makes some very important investments in early childhood education and care, expanding that significantly to reduce those costs for families, the expansion of paid parental leave, and Sam Mostyn's Economic Equality Task Force will be looking at a use it or lose it provision for dads, for second carers, mainly dads, in that policy to try to shift some cultural change there, and a number of measures around family violence. And some of the housing, social housing that's been funded, of course, is specifically dedicated to women and children fleeing family violence. But when we really think about genuine gender responsive budgeting, it's not just looking at what are traditionally thought of women's issues, it's applying that lens to policies across the board, which was a point I made yesterday at Parliament House. So as one of, three, I think now, PhD economists in the government and the chair of the Economics Committee, what's your view about how we can expect that to work, particularly when it comes to applying a gender lens to benefit everyone, not just women, to core economic policies like the tax and transfer system in the future?
Yeah, well, thanks, Emma. Look at the current rate of growth of economic PhDs in the Parliament. I think by 2100, the whole Parliament will be economics PhDs. Won't that be thrilling?
I hope not.
Yeah, probably. Well, look, I kind of feel like in this topic, I should probably be, listening more to you than, what we need to be doing than, opining. But look, I do think, from my vantage point, I think this budget was a big step forward, and I think Katie's really, raised the profile of this lens and drawn a lot of strands together. And so I think, and she herself acknowledged in a range of forums that I saw, including there was a big event after the budget where Ray Martin interviewed Katie and Jim, and actually didn't hold any punches. So, it was a good interview. Katie talked about this as the first step in a journey. But as you said, Katie alluded to the fact that what she didn't want to see was that, I think the women's statement would basically pick a whole bunch of topics that were seen as traditionally of, relevance to women and just look at those. And I guess, look, I don't have a total answer here, and I'm really interested in your views and others on how we go down that journey. And I'm sure Katie and many other women in caucus have strong views as to how we should go down that journey. But I guess one thing I'd say from the House Economics Committee so far is that one thing I've noticed this term, and it's a welcome change, is that we have asked a whole bunch of questions of the Reserve Bank around monetary policy, for example, and asked around, was forward guidance done well, and all the kinds of things you'd expect that was in the news. But there has been quite an emphasis on the distributional impacts of interest rate rises and the extent to which the RBA is considering that. And you can look at that from a range of perspectives. You can look at it from the perspective of geography or income, but also gender. And I think my sense is that one of the key things is that we start to think about issues like gender, but also income distribution in a range of areas where perhaps we in the past had just looked at things in an aggregate way. And I think that would also be a welcome development, trying to look at a range of economic and social phenomenon in a more nuanced and granular way. So I think that's one development. But as you say, I think when you put the gender lens on many of the issues that we have put forward over the last 6 months and in the budget, whether it be skills or whether it be housing, I think that they'll be delivered in a better way if we start from that gender lens.
Thank you. And I think that that's precisely what I was hoping to hear. The need to look at policies across the board and not just seeing, as you said, these as isolated women's issues or gender issues. And I did note that in the grilling of the RBA recently, it's that kind of disaggregating those questions and looking at things and how they affect different cohorts in the community is really important. We're going to move shortly to questions from the audience, and I would remind everyone, I can see there's a lively chat going on in the chat function, which is great, but I'm taking the questions from the Q&A feed and I'll get to as many of them as I can. I'm just going to ask David Epstein to give us some final thoughts on the discussion so far while I pull those questions together, if that's okay.
Yeah, look, I think you by starting off on gender, but just talking more widely about the deeper questions such as well-being measures, etc., etc. That sort of change in prism can't be overstated. When you go to look at things, whether it be on a demographic basis or even on a geographic basis, the impact of inflationary changes, for example, and changes in energy costs can be quite disproportionate on household disposable income and household living standards, depending on the circumstances of people. Where women work, for example, where people are living, how close they are to accessible public transport, versus having to use private vehicles, etc., etc. And more to the point, not only do they differ, in quite important ways, but they can have quite rapid impacts in situations like we've got at the moment, where prices are moving very fast, and then you have added domestic impacts like what's going to obviously occurred first of all during the New South Wales floods, where everyone was talking about cabbages and lettuces, and it was quite interesting watching that, because they didn't always pinpoint it back to what was occurring with the weather and climate. Sometimes they actually blame it on the Ukraine, etc., etc., which may also have its own impacts on things like grain. But we're going to see it again with what's occurring now in Victoria and probably more likely New South Wales. So it's really good that we are getting some policy focus on that, and more to the point, it seems to be policy focus that might just last beyond the current political debate. It'll be longer term, going over several years, and may actually have an impact on the overall design criteria for policies.
Thanks, David. An excellent point, and kind of a nice segue into the first question that I want to pose, which is directed to Daniel, but others feel free to jump in as well. This is from Stephen Richardson, and he says, thank you for your opening remarks. Stephen's interested in your perspective on the government's commitment to introduce Measuring What Matters statement in 2023. What is the government hoping to achieve with this, and how do we see it working in practice?
Yeah, look, I think it's a really welcome initiative, and I probably don't need to tell people on this call that GDP is a useful measure of economic activity, but anybody who's studied any kind of macroeconomics understands the limitations of GDP as a measure. GDP, of course, is put forward these days as something like it's come down from the mountain carved on tablets. But of course, it's really something that's only, as I understand it, and I'm pretty sure this is right, it's something which is a post-World War II invention largely. It's been around for 70 odd years. It's useful in that it's somewhat objective, in that you're measuring a certain class of transactions in the economy, but it's very limited in the sense that it's not necessarily measuring whether all of those transactions are actually making us better off or not. Of course, if crime rises, we all know the examples. If crime rises, then all the activities around dealing with that crime in the market economy go towards increasing GDP, but are they reflecting an increase in welfare? Probably not. And then, of course, there's the line between what's in the market economy and what's not. And, when caring activities go in or out of that line, it can have a significant impact on GDP, but its impact on welfare can be not necessarily reflected in those changes. So, look, I think, firstly, it starts a conversation around what is it we're trying to achieve here. And I think for the last few decades, GDP was a useful enough measure. It was, quite easy to measure, and it was comparable within a country over time, and it was comparable to some degree across countries. So that's no mean feat for any measure. But I think there's also been a growing understanding that we need to think about going back to first principles, like what is it we're trying to measure here? And it would be some kind of notion of people's quality of life or their level of satisfaction or their level of happiness. And GDP probably correlates with that, but it's certainly not a measure of it. And so there are all sorts of other things you might want to measure, like levels of crime, or people's access to services, or people's life expectancy. Now, the budget papers do a really good job of looking at some of the efforts by other countries to go down this path, and many countries are way ahead of us on this. I do think it's worth noting that while there are some areas of overlap, there's no universally agreed list of what things you should include. And some countries have a long list of individual indicators. Some have over 100 indicators that go into their measure of well-being. So that then raises questions of, are you measuring all of those accurately? How do you prioritise those? Do you build them all up into an index? So there's a whole bunch of, first order issues that I think we're going to have to think about. But I think first and foremost, it's a very useful exercise in getting us to think about what matters here. And clearly, increasing this number, GDP, is a good thing generally, but it's at its heart not getting to, I think, the actual goals that we're seeking. There have actually been some really interesting pieces of work in Australia over the last decade. The Victorian government and ANZOG and some other organisations have done some work around early intervention and how that leads to better outcomes, which is in a sense a part of this story. And I think they're pieces of work that will feed into this. And I think the last point I'll make is that, again, a number of organisations have made the point that in what we often call the non-market economy, we don't really even measure outcomes at the moment. We measure inputs and outputs. And so a large part of our economy, large parts of the care economy, education, healthcare, aged care, defence, a lot of these parts of the economy aren't even incorporated in our productivity measures, partly because we struggle to measure outcomes. So even if this prods us towards better defining and measuring outcomes, that's a really useful thing. So the Productivity Commission and the ABS are already working on that, as are statistical agencies in a number of countries. But I think this discussion will prod that along in a very useful way.
Thanks, Daniel. And that I'm going to segue from there into the second question from Kate Crawford in the audience, who says, she acknowledges, as we said at the start, that it's terrific to see fiscal and monetary policy aligned. But how can we start to shift revenue dependency on fossil fuels royalties and their byproducts towards revenue to fund new markets in decarbonisation and related mitigation of disasters? And I wonder if your reflection on that, Daniel, can include the fact the Treasurer did say that the Treasury has started looking again at the petroleum resource rent tax at the moment, and how that might be tweaked or improved.
Yeah, well, look, I think he's basically indicated that it's not on our agenda at this point to tweak that. And I think that reflects the fact that we went to the election with a pretty clear set of policies around tax. So during the course of this first term of what I hope is a long-term government, the focus will be on areas like multinational tax and compliance. And there's some gains to be made there, but there's also limits to how much you can achieve there. Now, look, when it comes to resource taxes, I get the point about reliance on resource taxes, and I hope I'm not misunderstanding the question, but there's also, I think, from one perspective, you might say, that if you look at it from a certain perspective, taxing certain resources, could potentially be part of the way in which you reflect certain externalities that they create. So in a sense, if we had gone down the path of a price on carbon, then certain resources would have had quite hefty taxes put on them. So I don't necessarily see, taxes on resources as necessarily a bad thing or pushing us in the wrong direction. I do get the point that it, in a sense, could be dangerous for the budget to be too addicted to those taxes. So I guess there's a little bit of a balance here where, I wouldn't want to take taxes off resources which are creating emissions, because that, in a sense, would potentially be sending perverse incentives. What I think we need to be doing is, moving towards a situation where clearly those resources domestically are used less. But I also feel as though it's likely that our economy is going to see strong exports of those resources for some time. Again, whether we're thinking gas and potentially even some types of coal. So I think if we're looking at our reliance on revenue from those resources, I think also we need to distinguish between the extent to which those resources are being consumed locally versus the extent to which they're being exported to other economies. So look, it's a hugely complicated issue that Kate's raised, and I'm just touching on a few dimensions of it. But look, I totally agree with the broad notion that we don't want our budget to be overly reliant on taxes on certain types of resources. But I also feel that you certainly wouldn't want to be reducing taxes on particular resources at this point.
Thanks, Daniel. And this is a related question, and I'm going to put it to the whole panel. It's really directed here at anybody, and it's from Julie Gelman. I think this is an interesting query because there's been a lot of talk, of course, about windfall profits tax and whether that should be imposed, particularly on the gas industry at the moment, given the significant profits they're making. Julie asked if anyone here can talk a bit about that, where windfall taxes have been applied elsewhere, how effectively they've worked, and both the positive and negative aspects of that. What impact might they have if they were introduced here, if a windfall tax was imposed here? Does anyone want to take that one?
Well, I might start with a quick comment, if I can, and just say that the one thing windfall taxes are able to do is capture some sort of benefit, but sometimes that's not necessarily the most sustainable way to tax something. There are ways to properly tax a resource, for instance, that doesn't then rely on, doesn't expose you as much to the to business cycles and so on. And in fact, I think there are other often companies use any form of tax that's reliant on profit as a way to hide profit. So I think there's other more effective ways, but as a principle, it's not such a bad one. I think the key thing though is that right now people are seeing these extra profits and they're not paying tax in the good times or the bad times, and they just want them to pay tax at least once.
Well said, Michael. I'm going to move on to a question. You mentioned, Daniel, and I think it's a really important point, that even if the government was to do a volte-face and say we're going to abandon the stage 3 tax cuts tomorrow, there wouldn't be any real benefit to the budget or anything for some years to come. And as you know, I'm pretty passionate about broadening the conversation away from income taxes and to other forms of taxation. So without stealing her question from her, Joe Healy North has asked, just generally, how do we start talking about taxing wealth? It's not something we do very well in Australia.
Yeah, look, so again, this one's definitely not a Dorothy Dixer, given the politics.
No, it's not.
Look, I think it's a really important question, though, and I think this goes back to Nick's framing that, ultimately we are going to have to grapple with some of these issues. And in a sense, it might be that in the second part of this term, we engage in a serious conversation. And the Treasurer's alluded to having a serious conversation. I think, Emma, you make the point that we've got to broaden the tax debate, I think, at some point from income tax. And I also think we have to recognise that as a share of GDP, income tax, we rely heavily on income tax in this country. So I think that if we're going to have that broader conversation, it's going to have to incorporate other kinds of taxation. I think if you want to start to think about wealth taxes, there are two strong arguments for doing that. One is an equity argument, in that if you rely too much on income taxes, then you end up taxing wage and salary earners heavily, and you don't tax necessarily people with large stores of wealth, or even people who can shift their income to other kinds of vehicles like corporate vehicles or trusts or whatever it might be. So I think there's an equity issue. And in some contexts, there's also an economic efficiency argument. So, for example, land tax, economists have been pushing for, well, I think it's almost centuries now. And some jurisdictions in Australia are looking at. So if you look at things like, the economic distortion of taxes, taxes on some asset classes, on some types of wealth, are less distortionary, I would argue. One of the tricky things, and it goes without saying, is that there's a huge political challenge here. So at the state level, there has been a couple of attempts to move from transaction taxes to land taxes, and Victoria's made some progress. The ACT's made a lot of progress, and I think New South Wales is obviously heading down that path. I think once you go into areas like, some of the super concessions, inheritance taxes, you get into areas that can become very politically tricky. But I certainly acknowledge that at the moment, we have a tax system that is very heavily reliant on income, and that if we're going to engage in a sensible tax debate, we're going to have to broaden it a bit at some point.
Yeah. Did anyone else want to comment on that issue?
Look, only in the very broad in the theoretical. I mean, I think we're sort of getting to a stage where, I mean, not only, I suppose Denmark's the only country that comes close to us in terms of reliance on income taxes. We are an outlier in the OECD world. It does pose some issues. It probably doesn't reflect the nature of, for example, the contracting and subcontracting workforce that's developed in a lot of areas like housing and construction and infrastructure these days. We do have some issues. I wouldn't want to go too far into the tricky area of superannuation, but at the very high end of self-managed funds, and then possibly what's occurred, in the housing market, where we're rapidly reaching a situation where there are a number of people who own multiple housing assets, and they're all in a certain age cohort, and that has an impact on the transfer of wealth, etc. And then you could possibly just simply look at things. I mean, Daniel's raised the land tax issue. Some people have had a bit of a go at that. The fuel tax, we're going to have to do something about that at some stage. It's rapidly becoming unsustainable, along with its notional hypothecation to fund road and transport infrastructure. It's getting very close to the point that, particularly for non-rail transport infrastructure, the system is broken.
Yes. Yeah.
And all of that goes back to the overall design of the tax system.
Thanks, David.
Can I jump in, Emma, just because I think this is such an important debate that also actually we need to work out as progressive organisations what's valuable to us. Because if you look at the Productivity Commission has some great data on this that shows the proportion of your income that comes from either wages and salaries versus capital. And it goes up and up and up, as you'd expect. But then in the very top decile, the top 10% of people, it falls. So what's happening is the people in the second top actually earn more from income, are going to be taxed higher from income tax than the people at the very top. So at some point, the progressive income tax system won't stay progressive in terms of the actual income of most people because it's coming from capital sources. And so we're not capturing the wealth of the top end, which is overwhelmingly being accumulated through passive assets. And I think that we're going to need to have that discussion at some point, because while certainly stage 3, I think there's a lot left to be desired. We need, we are overly reliant on income tax, but the solution isn't just to stop income tax. The solution is to transition to a better mix.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. And I think in response to Joe, who's perhaps not so satisfied with that answer, Joe, you asked, how do we start talking about this? This is how we start talking about it. And organisations like all of ours are going to have a role to play in that conversation. I think the Treasurer has been pretty clear, setting up the narrative about, well, these are the things we need to pay for. We need to pay for a strong, robust Medicare, a good NDIS, better standards of living, higher wages, more housing, more affordable housing. And so the other side of that conversation is, how do we raise the revenue to do that? And so I think the thing to bear in mind from everyone on this call is it's a big community conversation that needs to be had over the next couple of years. We are coming up to the end of our time together, but I think we've got time for one more question.
Emma, can I just quickly jump in a very quick point? The point which people may balk at. I do think if we're going to have that conversation, it will need to be, there needs to be a degree of bipartisanship. I don't think the opposition are there at this point.
No.
I thought the budget reply speech by the opposition leader Peter Dutton was odd, to say the least. Ending in a flourish of talking about education, which was really a sort of foray into early 2000 culture war politics, but I do think at some point the opposition needs to come around and have it take a mature adult approach to issues around tax and revenue and outlays.
I'm not going to hold my breath for that to happen, and
Neither am I.
I don't think we can wait for them, but let's try and drag them along with us. But actually, Nick, the point you made there does lead me really nicely to the last question that I wanted to relay from the audience, from Lucy O'Brien, because it goes to education and the opposition, then Morrison government's culture war against education. And of course, when they came up with the job ready, whatever it was, their education changes. I don't know what snappy title that Scotty from marketing gave it. But Lucy wants to know, is there a likelihood, and what likelihood might there be, Daniel, that Labor will reverse or alter the Morrison government's changes to university fee structures? Because we know, and she's absolutely right about this, Lucy, that these changes disproportionately penalise young women. They've increased the cost of courses preferred by young women, like humanities courses, and recent evidence showed actually that they had very little impact on shifting people's choices, because of course people aren't paying up front for these courses. So the kind of the economic nudge that they thought it might produce hasn't seemed to work anyway. What are your thoughts about where we might go with university funding? I know it's a huge challenge that Jason Clare's very exercised with at the moment, Daniel.
Yeah, I mean, look, this is where probably I'm not going to be able to give a super insightful answer. But look, I think what I would say is that I've certainly engaged with a lot of stakeholders, both as a local member and as I suppose, chair of House Economics on this issue. Whether it be public policy people or the NUS I met with 2 days ago. And other stakeholders representing young people. So look, this point has been made loud and clear to me. And in those discussions, look, it's become clear to me that Jason is also receiving all of that feedback. So certainly, I just kind of would say that if you look at the way in which the government's dealing with these issues overall, whether it be the skills agenda, or the way in which we're trying to reduce barriers for women to enter the workforce. I'd be very surprised if Jason doesn't take these concerns very seriously when thinking about how to adjust university funding and the way in which courses are charged. So I don't have any particular insight as to where it's going, but I would expect that there will be progress.
Thank you, Daniel. And that's just about all we've got time for. I'll give everyone an opportunity to just say a few words at the end, my own words, and I'm building on the second part of Lucy's question here. I'm not expecting a response from Daniel or anyone on this. Lucy mentioned in the second part of her question the impact of very low rates of income support on students and how much that meant many of them were struggling. And of course, that's true across the board. And while we saw a significant expenditure in this budget, and it shouldn't be dismissed lightly, the indexation payments to pensions and job seeker was something like $33 billion. That's not a real increase for those. And when we are, as a government, concerned with protecting the most vulnerable, this is purely a comment, it's something that the government's going to have to look at. This was a mini budget. There's another budget in May. And as all of our per capita people know, we'll be continuing to make the case for a meaningful increase in income support to the most vulnerable people in our nation. I'd like to invite you, each of you in turn, to say a few quick words. I'll start with you, Nick.
Oh, caught me on the hop here, Emma.
Sorry.
Thanks. No, I think it's been a terrific discussion. And I think the general consensus is this is just the start of the journey. And I think it's a good start. The adults seem to be back in charge. We're actually having cash isn't being sort of splashed around willy-nilly. And I think the budget sets the groundwork for a more substantial May budget next year. I think the Treasurer has been very keen to say that this is just the beginning of the journey of a series of budgets. So overall, I'd give the budget an A if I was returning to my roots as a university lecturer and tutor, but more work to do.
Thanks. Closing thoughts from you, Michael.
Oh, look, I tend to agree. I think we have become accustomed to quite big, something new in the budget. And this was actually mostly the budget was delivering on what was said earlier. And I actually think that maybe that's part of exactly what you said, Nick, about sort of returning to a more sensible approach. I want to thank everyone here as well, and also all the people at home. I have been reading all these comments, and it's sparking plenty of debate. And so I want to actually just riff off what Emma had said a moment ago, which is while one of the aspects that people on these low income payments do face that I think the future budgets need to address is if you're receiving JobKeeper for a year, you pay income tax, which means you pay your 19 cents in the dollar, as well as you're losing 50 cents for every extra dollar you earn, which means you take home 30 cents in the dollar of your income. That's effective marginal tax rates are a really big barrier. And the reason why that's so relevant in this most recent budget is that the government had changed childcare subsidies. And one of the big criticisms from a lot of progressive voices was around that went to households up to 350K. And I think that that's very reasonable, but at the same time, it does avoid large effective marginal tax rates at the lower end. And the alternative is to give lower levels of support. So I think they actually struck a really good mix there. And I'd like to see them do the same thing when it comes to income payments and income tax.
Well said, Mick. David, closing thoughts from you?
Well, Michael made a good point on childcare, and just from a Chifley perspective, we were really happy to see that one of the recommendations we'd put up in a childcare report for the disclosure of private sector revenue and profit in the childcare area has been implemented for this budget. So that's good. But look, in terms of the overall budget, let's sort of close the circle from where we started this conversation and where you, Emma, and Daniel ended. And we started, this was very much a budget about resetting parameters and defining strategy. And then you were just at the end, talking about the example of higher education funding, for example. And that's a classic area of what perhaps should be the third task of the government is how do you go forward with these new parameters and strategy and progressive policies and entrench them so that they can't be distorted down the track, either through the Senate or in the terrible circumstance of a new Conservative government being elected down the track. And we only have to look at what the Howard government did in the aged care area, in the upper end of family benefits, what various Liberal governments did to higher education funding, and particularly HECS, and what the Morrison government tried to do in NDIS. And coming out of that, I suppose the next thing we should be focusing on is how do you build in these positive changes that the government's embarked on in a way that preserves them long term?
Precisely, as we were able to do with Medicare. People should remember that Medicare was not always so supported, at least with lip service on both sides as it is today. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you for your fantastic questions from the floor. I'm sorry I could get to so few of them, but the good news is there'll be another budget in May, so you can join us then and we can re-prosecute these arguments then. I think it's Judith in the chat that said, where can we put forward our ideas to be part of this conversation? That's what these think tanks are here for. So please get in touch with us, stay on our mailing list, join our events and write to us. We've all got publicly available email addresses as well. And we are in the business of policy conversations and policy ideas. To Daniel Mulino, thank you so much for making time at the end of budget week. It's such a big week and tiring for everyone in the government. We really appreciate you giving up your Friday lunchtime to talk to us today.
Thanks for the opportunity. No, I really appreciate it. Thanks to all four think tanks. You've provided a wonderful forum today, but also ongoing for discussions. And as you say, I encourage everybody to put their ideas and also direct government, although not all to my.
Don't everyone swamp Daniel at once. Thank you so much, and we'll no doubt be back together for the May budget. I think we're getting to do a bit of a tradition here, and I certainly enjoy it. It's been lovely to see all of you, and we'll see you at the next Zoom or in-person event for any one of our think tanks. Thank you again, Daniel.
Thank you.
Thanks, Daniel.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.